This talk is called The Consequences of Awakening, and of course the consequences are vast. The fact that we're sitting here in a Buddhist centre 2,500 years after the Buddha in Northern Europe, well, a northern town in Europe, is just one of the many consequences of the Buddha's awakening. But that would be a vast talk, wouldn't it? I'm not going to talk about all that. I'm just going to talk about the Buddha's awakening itself, and then the few weeks or perhaps months immediately after, the effect it had on him, the consequences to him and eventually to us. So I'm going to begin with a short recap from the last time in April, where I gave a talk on the Buddha's life up to, but not including his awakening. So I'm just going to recap on that. And it began, actually I'm going to do a similar thing that I did last time, which is I'm going to base nearly everything I talk about on the Sutta Pitaka from the Pali Canon, apart from the very end when I'm going to refer to a Mahayana text. So I'm just going to move from one sutta, one text, to another and talk about it. And in the last talk I used the Arya Pariyesana Sutta and the Mahasachika Sutta mainly, but a few others. And I'm just going to tell you how the Buddha began what is called his noble quest, the Arya Pariyesana, from the Arya Pariyesana Sutta. He was reflecting. He'd had a very privileged life. He'd had a very luxurious life. But then he was reflecting one day, and he came to the conclusion there were two kinds of life that you could have. There's one which was going for all the things that most people go for, and there was another kind of life which he called the noble quest, which was going for things which were beyond the world, as it were. And he's talking to his monks, his followers, sometime later about that time, and he said, "Monks, there are these two searches, the ignoble search and the noble search." What is the ignoble search? There is the case where a person, being himself subject to birth, seeks happiness in what is likewise subject to birth. And he goes through a few more categories like this. Being subject himself to aging, to illness, to death, to sorrow, to defilement, he seeks happiness in what is likewise subject to illness, etc. And what is the noble search? There is the case where a person himself, being subject to birth, to aging, illness, death, sorrow, defilement, and seeing the drawbacks in those, seeks instead the aging less, the illness less, the death less, the sorrow less, the undefiled, unexcelled deliverance. And this is the noble search. So that's how his spiritual life began, with that reflection. And then what happened then, of course, was he left home, left his very privileged and luxurious life, and became a wanderer, which was a life of hardship and privation. Found a teacher, stayed with that teacher for a while, went as far as he could with that teacher, left that teacher, found another teacher, same thing happened. And then after that must have taken a few years, and then after that he took up what are called the ascetic practices, very common in India at that time, which is where you torture the body, basically. The idea being that the body is wrong, bad, evil, and your inner self has to be delivered from that. And the way you do that is to give your body a really hard time. And he did that for a number of years. We don't know how many years, but tradition usually says about 6 years. Did that for a very long time, and eventually he realized that wasn't getting him anywhere. So he gave that up too. and he began to take food again because he was starving himself, began to take food. And then he spontaneously had a memory of childhood where his father was occupied doing something and leaving him as a child to himself. And he spontaneously went into this rather beautiful, you might call a spiritual state of mind. It seems from his description of it pretty close to the first jhana, and it was very spontaneous. And he remembered that, and he thought, that's the way to go. That's the way to go. So, that's where we left him last time, and we're going to take up the story again now. So, I'm just going to read you again from the Arya Pariyesana Sutta. In search of what might be skillful, seeking the unexcelled state of sublime peace, I wandered by stages in the Magadhan country and came to the town of Uruvela. There I saw some delightful countryside with an inspiring forest grove, a clear flowing river with fine, delightful banks, and villages for alms going, for begging food, on all sides. And then a thought occurred to me. How delightful is this countryside, with its inspiring forest grove, clear flowing river, with fine delightful banks, and villages for alms going on all sides. This is just the right for the exertion of someone intent on exertion. So I sat down there, right there, thinking, this is just right for exertion or striving. So he sat there for a very long time, and eventually he gained awakening. And there are two main descriptions of his awakening. And I'm going to read you the one from the Arya Pariyesana Sutta. I'm going to stay with that sutta for a while. And it's basically telling us he actually experienced the end of the noble quest. So then he says, then monks, being subject myself to birth, I reached the unborn. The unborn. Being myself subject to aging, I reached the aging less. And then he goes on like that. The illness less. The death less. The sorrow less. So he reached the end of his noble quest. Knowledge and vision arose in me. Unprovoked is my release, my deliverance, my freedom. This is my last birth. There is now no further becoming. I'll say a bit more about the last birth and no more further becoming a bit later. But this is what he realised. And in a way, it doesn't tell you very much. There's a lovely couple of lines in the Ratnaguna Samchayagata, a Mahayana Sutta, where the Buddha says something like, we say the Buddha's enlightened, but we can't comprehend what that means. We say these words, don't we? Especially in beginners' classes. You know, enlightenment is a state of wisdom and compassion and freedom. And we say them so often we begin to think we know what we're talking about, but actually it's beyond our understanding. We say the Buddha's enlightened, but we can't comprehend what that really means. So this description of the Buddha's enlightenment is beyond our understanding. It's kind of mysterious. It doesn't really help us very much. So I'm going to move on now to another one. This is back to the Mahasachika Sutta. And so this tells us a bit more. He says that he got into first jhana, and then second jhana, then third, and then fourth jhana. He describes all that to us. And then he says, when my mind was thus concentrated, purified, bright, unblemished, rid of defilement, pliant, malleable, steady, and attained to imperturbability, I directed my mind to the knowledge of recollecting my past lives. So this was in the middle of the night. He was meditating in the middle of the night. He got really, really concentrated. And his mind was really pliant and malleable and workable and bright. And he decided to recollect his previous lives. I recollected my manifold past lives, i.e. one birth, previous to this birth, 2 births, 5, 10, you see where this is going, I expect, 100, 1,000, 100,000, many aeons of cosmic contraction. Here I need to say a bit about Buddhist cosmology, or ancient Indian cosmology. We had the idea that the universe came into being very small and got bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then it contracted back down to nothing again. So you get these cyclic aeons of contraction and the opposite of contraction.
Expansion.
Pardon?
Expansion.
Yes, thank you. That's exactly what it says here, in fact. Many aeons of cosmic contraction, many aeons of cosmic expansion, many aeons of cosmic contraction and expansion. In other words, almost infinite time in the past. He remembered all these past lives. And he remembered in great detail, there I had such a name, belonged to such a clan, had such an appearance, such was my food, such my experience of pleasure and pain, such the end of my life. Passing away from that state, I arose here. Thus, I remembered my manifold lives. So he remembered each one of these lives in great detail. This is quite something, isn't it? And I'm lingering on this because it's an aspect of the Buddha's enlightenment that we kind of neglect. We hardly ever talk about this, but he remembered all his past lives, all of them in great detail. That is quite something, isn't it, to reflect on. Just imagine if you remembered the whole of this life in such detail. There I lived in such a town and I used to eat that kind of food, and my appearance was such and such. Remember, just imagine just remembering every single detail of this life, and then you go, but the Buddha went way, 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 way back. And then he says, this was the first knowledge I attained to in the first watch of the night. And ignorance was destroyed. Knowledge arose. Darkness was destroyed. Light arose. As happens, is one who is heedful, ardent, and alert. Later on in the night, when the mind was thus concentrated, etc., etc., I directed it to the knowledge of the passing away and reappearance of other beings. I saw by means of the divine eye, purified and surpassing the human eye, beings passing away and reappearing, and I discerned how they are inferior and superior, beautiful and ugly, fortunate and unfortunate, in accordance with their karma, in accordance with their actions. These beings, who were endowed with bad conduct of body, speech and mind, who reviled the noble ones, held wrong views, and undertook actions under the influence of wrong views, with the break-up of their body after death, have reappeared in the plane of deprivation, bad destinations, the lower realms, in hells. But these beings, who were endowed with good conduct of body, speech and mind, etc., etc., after death have reappeared in the good destinations, in heavenly worlds. Thus, by means of the passing away and reappearing of beings, I discerned, etc., etc. In accordance with their karma, in accordance with their actions. So that's another one of the Buddha's great insights. This was actually very, very new. In India in those days, of course, people believed in rebirth. Many people believed in rebirth. And apparently, many people had had the experience that the Buddha just had of remembering all their past lives and also seeing beings being reborn and passing away with means of the divine eye. But what was different here with the Buddha, that he saw how their rebirth was conditioned by their actions. So this is very new. The Buddha brought this into being, into Indian philosophy, probably into the world actually. That was the second knowledge. And then the third one, early in the morning, I directed it to knowledge of the ending of the asavas. So the asavas, there are different translations of the asavas, but probably the best one is the biases or the proclivities, the way we lean, what we tend to do. And the asavas, he tells you what they were. The asava of sensuous pleasures. So the tendency we have, every human being has, towards sensuous pleasures. And then the next one, there were three asavas altogether. The next one is the tendency towards continued existence in one form or another, to just carry on in a way, the lust for life, in a way. You just want to carry on in some form or other, either as a human being or a god or whatever. And then the third one is the bias towards ignorance. So in Buddhist teachings, ignorance is actually an ethical action, an unethical action, because you have a bias towards ignorance. So you could say that ignorance is ignorance, that you don't want to know. So these are the three asavas, and you can see how the first two knowledges, they're called the abhijñas, which is the often translated as the super knowledges or the higher knowledges, and you can see how they work together. So first of all, the Buddha had this vision, if you like, of all his previous lives going unendingly back, and the inference of that is if he didn't do anything about that, this is going to carry on over and over and over and over again without end. So he had this huge insight, and you can see how breaking the asava of the second asava of continued existence, the bias towards, the proclivity towards conditioned existence, is broken by seeing how far back it goes and how far in the future it goes. Actually, that may not be obvious to you why that works, but as we know from what the Buddha said later many times, is that conditioned existence is shot through with suffering. So what the Buddha was seeing, going way back, infinitely back, was one human life after another, suffering, and that's going to just carry on unless he does something about it. So he broke the asava of the bias towards continued existence. And then seeing the beings being reborn again and again and again in accordance with their karma, that's connected with ignorance, the overcoming of ignorance, because the reason beings do what they do is because they're ignorant. You know, they're doing. Everyone does what they do because they think that's going to make them happy. But of course, in most cases, it doesn't work, and that's because of their ignorance. So to overcome the bias of ignorance is a real boon to people, when they can start seeing, hey, what's happening here? I keep doing that, and this keeps happening. It's not working for me. So what's going wrong? So then you begin to start understanding what's happening in your life. And then What's the answer that I haven't done yet? I've done
Sensuous pleasures.
sensuous pleasures, yes. Yeah. So sensuous pleasures is connected with ignorance, of course, because most people try to get their happiness from sense pleasures. So that's what that's the content of the Buddha's awakening according to the Mahasachika Sutta. And the Mahasachika Sutta is the Buddha telling his life story to this guy called Sachika. So according to the Buddha, this is what happened in the night. And in the morning he broke the 3 asavas. He broke them. He was liberated from those proclivities towards ignorance, towards continued existence, and towards sense pleasures. And then he was free. So this is quite an interesting way of understanding what enlightenment really is, what awakening really consists in. So that's the awakening. And now I want to talk a little bit about what happened soon afterwards. Actually, before I do that, just say a few more words about this, his experience on the night of his awakening. You can see that him remembering all his previous lives and then seeing with his divine eye beings being born and reborn again in accordance with their karma, with their actions, is that his main concern, even on the night of his enlightenment, was with the human condition, the suffering inherent in the human condition. And that's what he was delivered from, freed from in his enlightenment. Okay, so then, after the awakening, the Mahasachika Sutta and the Arepariyesana Sutta, the 2 suttas I've been drawing on so far, are from the Majjhima Nikaya, the middle-length sayings. And they're, as it were, later suttas. There are some very early suttas we know about. One of them is Udana, and the other is Sutta Nipata, or at least parts of the Sutta Nipata. And there's a few short suttas in the beginning of the Udana which describe the Buddha's enlightenment, or at least they describe the weeks after his enlightenment. So the first one goes, "Thus have I heard, at one time the Buddha was staying at Uruvela, and on that occasion he sat at the root of the Bodhi tree for 7 days in one session, sensitive to the bliss of release." So according to the Udana at least, the Buddha just sat there after this experience for 7 days, experiencing the bliss of release, of freedom. No need to go anywhere, no need to do anything. Then at the end of those 7 days, he reflected on his experience during the night. He reflected on that. It says he gave well-reasoned attention during the last watch of the night to dependent arising, conditioned co-production, as we say. This being, that becomes. From the arising of this, that arises. This not being, that does not become. From the ceasing of this, that ceases. And then there's a verse, beautiful verse. When things become plain to the ardent, meditating Brahmin, he abides, scattering Mara's host, like the sun illumining the sky. There are a few suttas in the Udana where the Buddha, presumably it's the Buddha, must be the Buddha talking about it because there's no one else there, about the weeks after his enlightenment. And that was developed later on in a text called the Mahavastu. And it was developed so that there were 7 weeks after the Buddha's enlightenment where the Buddha just stayed around the Bodhi tree. And this, I think, is mythical rather than historical, because 7 weeks is kind of mystical 7 sevens, isn't it? 49 and all that kind of thing. But which we don't need to take too literally. But we can just imagine what it must have been like for him to have this massive experience, the thing that he'd been searching for many, many years. And he had that during the night. And the effect was, huge on him. The consequences were for absolutely massive. And it probably took him a while to come to terms with that, to really understand what had happened. There's another text. From the Udana again. Thus have I heard, at one time the Lord was staying at Uruvela, having just realised full enlightenment. At that time, the Buddha sat cross-legged for 7 days experiencing the bliss of liberation. Now it happened that there occurred out of season a great rainstorm, and for 7 days there were rain clouds, cold winds and unsettled weather. Then Muchalinda, the Naga king, left his dwelling place and, having encircled the Lord's body 7 times round with his coils, Naga is like a great big serpent, he stood with his great hood spread over the Lord's head to protect him from cold and heat, from gadflies, mosquitoes, wind, sun, and the touch of creeping things. So this is obviously a mythical kind of thing that happened. At the end of those 7 days, the Buddha emerged from that concentration. Then Muchalinda, the Naga king, seeing that the sky had cleared and the rain clouds had gone, removed his coils from the Buddha's body. Changing his appearance and assuming the appearance of a youth, he stood in front of the Buddha with his hands folded together, venerating him. I'm not going to say anything about that because I want you to talk about that incident in your groups later. Leaving the Udana and going to another sutta, the sutta that many of you will be familiar with, the Gaurava Sutta. Again, it starts in the same way. I have heard on one occasion, the Blessed One was newly self-awakened, etc., etc. Then, when he was alone and in seclusion, this line of thinking arose in his awareness. So again, he's reflecting on his experience. And he thinks, one suffers if dwelling without reverence or deference. Now, on what Brahman or contemplative can I dwell in dependence, honouring and respecting him? So even though he's enlightened, he's reflecting on the need for reverence, to look up to somebody. And he says that people suffer if they don't have anyone to look up to. So he looks around the whole universe with his divine eye and he can't find anyone more enlightened than he is. Which is bad news for him. He wants someone to look up to and he can't find anyone to look up to. So that's bad news. So what he does, he decides that if he can't find any person that you can look up to, he will reverence the Dhamma. Yeah, the Dhamma. It's because of the Dhamma that he gained enlightenment. So he looks up to the Dhamma. The Dhamma here is obviously not the Buddha's teachings because he hasn't started teaching yet. It's the kind of mechanisms and right. It's the law. It's the way things work. Yeah. So he's looking up to that. And then A god, the king of the gods in fact, Brahma Sahampati, turns up, magically turns up. Arranging his upper robe over one shoulder, he saluted the Blessed One with his hands before his heart and said to him, "So it is, Blessed One, so it is. Those who were arahants, rightly self-awakened ones in the past, they too dwelled in dependence on the very Dhamma itself, honouring and respecting it. So let the Blessed One, who is at present the Arahant, the rightly self-awakened one, dwell in dependence on the very Dhamma itself, honouring and respecting it." I'm not going to say anything about Brahma Sahampati turning up at that moment. He's going to turn up again soon. But again, I want you to discuss that in your groups. You know, what's that all about? Why does he turn up? So, then what happened is the Buddha's reflecting on his experience, and he begins to reflect on the experience that he had, and then he thinks, then he said, the text says, then the thought occurred to me. This Dhamma that I have attained is deep, gambira, deep or profound, hard to see, hard to realise, peaceful, refined, beyond the scope of reason, subtle, to be experienced only by the wise. But this generation delights in attachment, is excited by attachment, enjoys attachment. For a generation delighting in attachment, etc., etc., this conditioned co-production is hard for them to see. This state too is hard to see. The resolution of all, says fabrications, things. The relinquishment of all acquisitions, the end of craving, dispassion, cessation, nirvana. And if I were to teach the Dhamma and others would not understand me, that would be tiresome to me, troublesome to me. So he decides he's not going to teach. People won't understand it. I think you probably all know this. So I'm not going to stay with this. Brahma Sahampati turns up again, the king of the gods. Having known with his own awareness the line of thinking in my awareness, this is the Buddha talking, thought, the world is lost, the world is destroyed. The mind of the Buddha inclines to dwelling at ease, not to teaching the Dhamma. So he turns up again in front of the Buddha, gets on his knees, asks him, Lord, teach the Dhamma. Please teach the Dhamma. There are beings with little dust in their eyes who are falling away because they do not hear the Dhamma. There will be those who understand the Dhamma. Then, having understood Brahma's invitation, out of compassion for beings, I surveyed the world with the eye of the awakened one. As I did so, I saw beings with little dust in their eyes, and those with much dust in their eyes, those with keen faculties and those with dull, those with good attributes and those with bad, those easy to teach and those hard to teach. Some of them seeing disgrace and danger in the other world. Just as in a pond of blue or red or white lotuses, born growing in the water, might flourish while immersed in the water, without rising up from the water. Some might stand at an even level with the water, while some might rise up from the water and stand without being smirched by the water. smeared by the water. So too, surveying the world with the eyes of an awakened one, I saw beings with little dust in their eyes, etc., etc. So he decides to teach. So again, it's interesting, isn't it? Brahma Sahambhati, the king of the gods, the highest of all the gods, turns up twice soon after the Buddha's enlightenment. So there's something very interesting there, I think, that can be discussed in our groups. So he decides to teach. So who does he teach? Well, first of all, he thinks about the people he knows. This is quite interesting, I find. He doesn't just go and start teaching people. He thinks, who might understand? So he thinks about his two previous teachers, Alara Kalama and Udaka Ramaputta. And he thinks, I think they'll understand. But again, with his divine eye, he sees that both of them have died since he knew them. Then he thinks about the 5 ascetics, his friends, who practiced the ascetic practice together for many years. And he thinks, I'll look for them. So he finds them, and he walks for, I think, 2 weeks back to where he knew them, and he finds them. And I think you all know the story. They saw him and they were disgusted with him. He gave up the spiritual life as far as they're concerned and went back to the low life. And so they don't really want to have anything to do with him, but he eventually convinces them that he's worth listening to. And he says, look, I'm enlightened. And they say, pfft. And he says, look, have I ever said anything like this to you before? No, you haven't, that's true. So then they begin to listen to him. And the text says that he teaches them the 4 Noble Truths and the Middle Way and the Eightfold Path. But that seems very unlikely. Those are quite well-developed teachings, and these are the first people he's taught. So it's unlikely that he had anything quite so developed. And if you look at some of the very early texts, like the Udana or the early parts of the Sutta Nipata, when the Buddha's teaching in those very early texts, he doesn't have a well-thought-through path. It's very much, very, very simple in those early texts. He says some... He just talks about awakening to them, what it's like, but he doesn't tell them how they can do it themselves, and they either get it or they don't. And I have a theory about this, that when the Buddha first began to teach, he didn't really know how to teach. He didn't know how to get people to where he got to. He told people about where he got to, and a few people got it, but many people didn't. And so then I think he began to think, well, I need to tell them how to get from A to B. So how do I do that? How do they go about getting to where I am? So then he began to think about the Threefold Way and the Eightfold Path and so on. But I think it's highly unlikely he got anything so worked out when he was talking to the 5 ascetics. And it's interesting that although in the text it's as if he gives this well thought out talk, well structured talk, it also says that he was with them for many days, because it was more like a very long study group, that there were 6 of them, and 2 of them went off to get some food to the local village and came back, and then they ate together, and then the next day 3 of them went off to another place and came back. So it must have lasted for days, the Buddha trying to help these 5 people gain enlightenment. And then, of course, as we know, one of them got it. One of them just got it, Kondanya. And the Buddha was utterly delighted, and he said, Kondanya has understood, Kondanya has understood. And this was a massive thing for the Buddha, because then once he saw that Kondanya had got it, he realized, oh, it is possible to teach the Dhamma. It is possible. Some people will get it. And then they stayed there for, longer, more days. And then one by one, all the others gained enlightenment. And then there were 6 people in the world who had gained enlightenment. And it went on from there, really. And the rest is history, as we say. So I've been drawing on these texts from the Pali Canon. But I want to draw on the Mahayana to end with. But before I do that, There's a very interesting lecture by Bhante called What is Nirvana? And in that, he's been talking about Nirvana for a while, and he says there's a problem with talking about Nirvana because what happens is Buddhists, what we tend to do is we tend to set Nirvana as our goal. So Bhante then starts, Bhante is Sangrachta, he then starts talking about the psychology of goal setting, in a way the problem of setting ourselves goals. So when you set yourself the goal of gaining enlightenment, because you don't really know what enlightenment is, you've set yourself this goal way far in the future, and it begins to represent happiness for you, and you're more or less unhappy, or there's suffering in your life at least. So you set yourself this goal where there's no suffering at all, and there's a problem with doing that, because what the problem is that you tend to look at the goal and try to reach that goal without realizing, without understanding what it is that's causing you suffering. So instead of trying to get to the goal, what you need to do is come back to your actual experience and understand it, to really concentrate and investigate your current experience. And there's an interesting book about the mindfulness of breathing, actually, talking about the mindfulness of breathing as you were earlier, Vishanka, called Breath by Breath by Larry Rosenberg. And there's a very interesting bit in there where he talks about what he calls the paradox of meditation. And we can widen that to be the paradox of the spiritual life, or the paradox of the inner life, in a way, the paradox of your interior life. And the paradox goes like this: you all want to get from A to B. So in this sense, A is samsara, the world of suffering, and we want to get to nirvana. We want to get from A to B. How do you get from A to B? You have to really be at A. That's the paradox. You can't make yourself get to B, you have to really be at A. What does it mean to really be at A? It means to really be in your own experience, be fully aware, fully mindful of your own experience, and learn from it. Yeah? So I say that because I don't want you to set yourself up this goal and be reaching for it, striving for it, without really understanding what it is that makes you suffer. But I'm going to end with something from this book, the Lalita Vistra. The Lalita Vistra is a Mahayana text, and it's translated as extensive play, or play in full. So it's the Bodhisattva's life as a series of playfulnesses, in a way. And I'm just going to read you this because it's completely different from the other readings. It's very mythical. The Lalita Vistra, it tells the story of the Buddha's life, but in a mythical way rather than a historical way. And I want to end you with this. This is a description of just after the Buddha's enlightenment. The realms of beings were restored to proper balance. All positive things were praised. All lower things were rejected. All beings not so established were understood. The character of all beings was observed, and the conduct of all beings was perfectly known. The remedy for the sickness of beings was well understood. The nectar of immortality was applied. The king of physicians manifested. The freedom from all suffering was set forth, establishing beings in the happiness of nirvana. The Buddha himself was seated on the great throne of the king of the Dhamma, for the means of arriving at complete deliverance was obtained. He entered into the city of omniscience. Indivisible from the knowledge of the sphere of the Dhamma, he joined with the truth and with all the Buddhas. At the very moment that the Bodhisattva obtained omniscience, at that very instant, all the sentient beings in all the worlds in the 10 directions experienced great bliss. In all the 10 directions a great splendour illumined all the world realms, and even the sinister hellish regions, enveloped in darkness, were bathed in light. In all directions the earth shook in 6 ways. It shook hard on all sides. It trembled hard on all sides. It quaked vigorously on all sides. It was disturbed. It was greatly disturbed on all sides. It reverberated loudly on all sides. It resounded loudly on all sides. In all of the 10 directions of space, the Bodhisattvas and the Devas uttered cries of gladness. He has appeared, the lotus of beings, born from the ocean of knowledge. He comes forth untouched by the worldly dharmas, embracing the sphere of the Dhamma. He is the great and noble cloud of compassion, which will rain down the medicine of the Dhamma for beings capable of being trained. From the seeds of virtue, tender shoots will sprout forth and grow strong. In time, the fruits of liberation will come forth and will fall like rain.